And these have been truly massive. That is, we don't just get a few more questions right on IQ tests. We get far more questions right on IQ tests than each succeeding generation back to the time that they were invented. Indeed, if you score the people a century ago against modern norms, they would have an average IQ of 70. If you score us against their norms, we would have an average IQ of 130. Now, this has raised all sorts of questions. Were our immediate ancestors on the verge of mental retardation? Because 70 is normally the score for mental retardation. Or are we on the verge of all being gifted? Because 130 is the cutting line for giftedness. Now, I'm going to try and argue for a third alternative that's much more illuminating than either of those. And to put this into perspective, let's imagine that a Martian came down to Earth and found a ruined civilization. And this Martian was an archaeologist, and they found scores, target scores, that people had used for shooting. And first they looked at 1865, and they found that in a minute, people had only put one bullet in the bullseye. And then they found in 1898 that they'd put about 5 bullets in the bullseye in a minute. And then about 1918, they put 100 bullets in the bullseye. And initially, that archaeologist would be baffled. They would say, look, these tests were designed to find out how much people were steady of hand, how keen their eyesight was, whether they had control of their weapon. How could these performances have escalated to this enormous degree? Well, we now know, of course, the answer. If that Martian looked at battlefields, they would find that people had only muskets at the time of the Civil War, and that they had repeating rifles at the time of the Spanish-American War, and then they had machine guns by the time of World War I. And in other words, it was the equipment that was in the hands of the average soldier that was responsible, not greater keenness of eye or steadiness of hand. Now, what we have to imagine is the mental artillery that we have picked up over those 100 years. And I think, again, that another thinker will help us here, and that's Luria. Luria looked at people just before they entered the scientific age. And he found that these people were resistant to classifying the concrete world. They wanted to break it up into little bits that they could use. He found that they were resistant to deducing the hypothetical, to speculating about what might be. And he found finally that they didn't deal well with abstractions or using logic on those abstractions. Now let me give you a sample of some of his interviews. He talked to the head man of a person in rural Russia. They'd only had, as people had in 1900, about 4 years of schooling. And he asked that particular person, what do crows and fish have in common? And the fellow said, absolutely nothing. You know, I can eat a fish, I can't eat a crow. A crow can peck at a fish can't do anything to a crow. And the Luria said, but aren't they both animals? And he said, of course not. One's a fish, you know, the other is a bird. And he was interested effectively in what he could do with those concrete objects. And then Luria went to another person, and he said to them, there are no camels in Germany. Hamburg is a city in Germany. Are there camels in Hamburg? And the fellow said, well, if it's large enough, there ought to be camels there. And Luria said, but what do my words imply? And he said, well, maybe it's a small village and there's no room for camels. In other words, he was unwilling to treat this as anything but a concrete problem. And he was used to camels being in villages, and he was quite unable to use the hypothetical, to ask himself, what if there were no camels in Germany? A third interview was conducted with someone about the North Pole. And Luria said, at the North Pole there is always snow. Wherever there is always snow, the bears are white. What color are the bears at the North Pole? And the response was, such a thing is to be settled by testimony. If a wise person came from the North Pole and told me the bears were white, I might believe him. But every bear that I've seen is a brown bear. Now you see again, this person has rejected going beyond the concrete world and analyzing it through everyday experience. And it was important to that person what color bears were. That is, they had to hunt bears. They weren't willing to engage in this. One of them said to Luria, how can we solve things that aren't real problems? None of these problems are real. How can we address them? Now, these three categories, classification, using logic on abstractions, taking the hypothetical seriously, how much difference do they make in the real world beyond the testing room? And let me give you a few illustrations. First, almost all of us today get a high school diploma. That is, we've gone from 4 to 8 years of education to 12 years of formal education, and 52% of Americans have actually experienced some type of tertiary education. Now, not only do we have much more education, and much of that education is scientific, and you can't do science without classifying the world. You can't do science without proposing hypotheses. You can't do science without making it logically consistent. And even down in grade school, things have changed. In 1910, they looked at the examinations that the state of Ohio gave to 14-year-olds. And they found that they were all for socially valued concrete information. They were things like, what are the capitals of the 44 or 5 states that existed at that time? When they looked at the exams that the state of Ohio gave in 1990, they were all about abstractions. They were things like, why is the largest city of a state rarely the capital? And you were supposed to think, well, the state legislature was rural controlled, and they hated the big city, so rather than putting the capital in a big city, they put it in a county seat. They put it in Albany rather than New York. They put it in Harrisburg rather than Philadelphia, and so forth. So the tenor of education has changed. We're educating people to take the hypothetical seriously, to use abstractions, and to link them logically. What about employment? Well, in 1900, 3% of Americans practiced professions that were cognitively demanding. Only 3% were lawyers or doctors or teachers. Today, 35% of Americans practice cognitively demanding professions. Not only the professions proper, like lawyer or doctor or scientist or lecturer, but many, many sub-professions having to do with being a technician, a computer programmer, a whole range of professions now make cognitive demands. And we can only meet the terms of employment in the modern world by being cognitively far more flexible. And it's not just that we have many more people in cognitively demanding professions. The professions have been upgraded. Compare the doctor in 1900, who really had only a few tricks up his sleeve, with a modern general practitioner or specialist with years of scientific training. Compare the banker in 1900, who really just needed a good accountant and to know who was trustworthy in the local community for paying back their mortgage. Well, the merchant bankers who brought the world to their knees may have been morally remiss, but they were cognitively very agile. They went far beyond that 1900 banker. They had to look at computer projections for the housing market. They had to get complicated CO squared in order to bundle debt together and make debt look as if it were actually a profitable asset. They had to prepare a case to get rating agencies to give it a AAA, though in many cases they had virtually bribed the rating agencies. And they also, of course, had to get people to accept these so-called assets and pay money for them, even though they were highly vulnerable. Or take a farmer today. I think the farm manager of today is very different from the farmer of 1900. So it hasn't just been the spread of cognitively demanding professions. It's also been the upgrading of tasks like lawyer and doctor and what have you that have made demands on our cognitive faculties. But I've talked about education and employment. Some of the habits of mind that we have developed over the 20th century have paid off in unexpected areas. I'm primarily a moral philosopher. I merely have a holiday in psychology, and what interests me in general is moral debate. Now, over the last century, in developed nations like America, moral debate has escalated because we take the hypothetical seriously. And we also take universals seriously and look for logical connections. When I came home in 1955 from university at the time of Martin Luther King, a lot of people came home at that time and started having arguments with their parents and grandparents. My father was born in 1885, and he was mildly racially biased. As an Irishman, he hated the English so much he didn't have much emotion for anyone else. But he did have a sense that black people were inferior. And when we said to our parents and grandparents, how would you feel if tomorrow morning you woke up black? They said, that is the dumbest thing you've ever said. Who have you ever known who woke up in the morning that turned black? In other words, they were fixed in the concrete mores and attitudes they had inherited. They would not take the hypothetical seriously. And without the hypothetical, it's very difficult to get moral argument off the ground. You have to say, you know, imagine you were in Iran, and imagine that your relatives all suffered from collateral damage, even though they had done no wrong. How would you feel about that? And if someone of the older generation says, well, our government takes care of us and it's up to their government to take care of them, they're just not willing to take the hypothetical seriously. Or take an Islamic father whose daughter has been raped and he feels he's honor bound to kill her. Well, he's treating his mores as if they were sticks and stones and rocks that he had inherited, and they're unmovable in any way by logic. They're just inherited mores. Today we would say something like, well, imagine you were knocked unconscious and sodomized. Would you deserve to be killed? And he would say, well, that's not in the Quran. You know, that's not one of the principles I've got. Well, you today universalize your principles. You state them as abstractions and you use logic on them. If you have a principle such as people shouldn't suffer unless they're guilty of something, then to exclude black people, you've got to make exceptions, don't you? You have to say, well, blackness of skin, you couldn't suffer just for that. It must be that blacks are somehow tainted. And then we can bring empirical evidence to bear, can't we? And say, well, how can you consider all blacks tainted when St. Augustine was black and Thomas Sowell is black? And you can get moral argument off the ground then, because you're not treating moral principles as concrete entities. You're treating them as universals to be rendered consistent by logic. Now, how did all of this arise out of IQ tests? That's what initially got me going on cognitive history. If you look at the IQ test, you find the gains have been greatest in certain areas. The similarity subtest of the Wechsler is about classification, and we have made enormous gains on that classification subtest. There are other parts of the IQ test battery that are about using logic on abstractions. Some of you may have taken Raven's progressive matrices, and it's all about analogies. And in 1900, people could do simple analogies. That is, if you said to them, cats are like wild cats, what are dogs like? They would say wolves. But by 1960, people could attack ravens on a much more sophisticated level. If you said, we've got two squares followed by a triangle, what follows two circles? They could say a semicircle. Just as a triangle is half of a square, a semicircle is half of a circle. By 2010, college graduates, if you said two circles followed by a semicircle, two 16s followed by what? They would say 8, because 8 is half of 16. That is, they had moved so far from the concrete world that they could even ignore the appearance of the symbols that were involved in the question. Now, I should say one thing that's very disheartening. We haven't made progress on all fronts. One of the ways in which we would like to deal with the sophistication of the modern world is through politics. And sadly, you can have humane moral principles, you can classify, you can use logic on abstractions. And if you're ignorant of history and of other countries, you can't do politics. We've noticed a trend among young Americans that they read less history and less literature and less material about foreign lands. And they're essentially ahistorical. They live in the bubble of the present. They don't know the Korean War from the war in Vietnam. They don't know who was an ally of America in World War II. Think how different America would be if every American knew that this is the 5th time Western armies have gone to Afghanistan to put its house in order. And if they had some idea of exactly what had happened on those 4 previous occasions. And that is, they had barely left and there wasn't a trace in the sand. Or imagine how different things would be if most Americans knew that we had been lied into 4 of our last 6 wars. You know, the Spanish didn't sink the battleship Maine. The Lusitania was not an innocent vessel but was loaded with munitions. The North Vietnamese did not attack the 7th Fleet. And of course, Saddam Hussein hated Al-Qaeda and yet had nothing to do with it. And yet the administration convinced 45% of the people that they were brothers in arms when he would hang one from the nearest lamppost. But I don't want to end on a pessimistic note. The 20th century has shown enormous cognitive reserves in ordinary people that we have now realized. And the aristocracy was convinced that the average person couldn't make it, that they could never share their mindset or their cognitive abilities. Lord Curzon once said he saw people bathing in the North Sea, and he said, "Why did no one tell me what white bodies the lower orders have?" As if they were a reptile. Well, Dickens was right and he was wrong. Dickens said, "The Colonel's Lady and Judy O'Grady are sisters underneath the skin."
And you're at for the end.
So, actually, I hadn't planned on this, but it ties in beautifully to the articles we are reading today. Is we have Kierkegaard, who's very much part of the previous very concrete thinking. And as you might have read the page and a half or so of his text, how many of you felt like it was nonsense? It was basically like a kid being upset about meaning of life, right?
It almost had a completely different tone, though, from the first Kierkegaard we read, and that's what took me. It almost seemed hopeful. In this one,
it does end on a hopeful note.
Yeah, because he's talking about heroes and poets, but compared to where he was last, it was one of the first things we read in this class, where he essentially like, "I might as well just kill yourself," you know. Sorry, I actually took notes on it.
You shouldn't be sorry.
Yeah.
That's remember what
Flynn, I know, right?
What Flynn is suggesting is, a big problem with our contemporary people today is they're ahistorical, and the reason for that is they're not reading. So, that obviously is a good thing that you're reading.
He's like, "You're wrong, but thanks for reading."
But here's the thing. Why is there a big contrast between Kierkegaard and then the next article by Thomas Nagel? We're looking at something around the 90s, and we've read Nagel before too. Remember what's it like to be a bat? And then I thought the best one was the Robert Taylor article, because that was, I thought, that was 2010, I think the article was written, and you could see that the quality of discussion on that topic is improving over these. Now, granted, there's quite a leap from Kierkegaard to Thomas Nagel, but still, there's that same sense of progress that he's talking about with regard to the way each generation, the Flynn effect, so it got called that, by the way. He didn't call it the Flynn effect. That was Charles Murray in his book, The Bell Curve, that referred to his statistical notices or concerns about the IQ gains as the Flynn effect. So that's how that got called that. Now he even he refers to it that way himself, right? It's not his fault, but that's what everybody calls it. But so here's the interesting thing. It's still happening, as far as I know, that people's IQs are going up, but their overall knowledge is going down. So that's an interesting so the ahistorical nature of contemporary students is going down. What does that mean? They're reading less, right? And yet at the same time, their IQs are going up. What explains that? His main argument, essentially, in his books and here briefly in this argument, is that the nature of the life you have preps you to do better in IQ tests, because you're basically dealing with abstractions, categorical comparisons and things, using logic, so that you're more adept at those kinds of tests than people would have been, say, 10 years before, 20 years before, et cetera, right? But here's another aspect that he doesn't touch upon, and that is that you are also using devices constantly now. You are, actually, it was kind of funny asking what was your favorite music. I found some people, for example, never listen to music except while they're in their car. You know, it's
What's
like
wrong
they don't
with
have.
That's exactly what's
And I
going
thought, whoa. I mean, heck, it was the longest while before I actually had a car. And at one point, I remember one of the cars I bought was so cheap it didn't even have a radio. Although eventually I did add a radio, but.
So here's a question. So we're seeing this increase in cognitive, thought processes and whatnot, and we're educating more of it, so they're getting better at the test. And at the same time, you pointed out we've got the devices, but really it's up to the individual what they're going to look at. So whether they're reading any of these texts, which we could have on that device, or nonsense and bullshit from Facebook.
Cat videos.
Yeah, cat videos, yeah. Depends on the individual, and it makes you wonder, we're leaning more towards the cognitive, but at the same time, we're losing more of that concrete understanding of the world around us, that historical.
Plus, there's what about this?
Well, there's almost an flow of information
Yeah.
online. You can look up anything if you can find it amongst all
If you
the
don't
other
get
crap out
distracted.
there. I mean, you could look for, I don't know, how to make your own computer, and you can have half a dozen thousand different texts. You're like, okay, what do I do now? What do I pick?
Yeah.
You don't want to read them
Which
all.
one is even right?
Yeah, so it's almost a handicap now that we have so much information.
So there's a video, and I don't know if you guys have seen this, but it's like 2 minutes long, and it's a group of college students, and they're all sitting around this girl as she's trying to open a can with a can opener. And it's dead silent in the room, and they're all hanging on her every motion as she goes to open this can, and it is the most difficult, painful thing to watch. It is for her, because it takes her a whole 2 minutes to just figure it out.
Okay, so I know the video you're talking about. Have you seen the whole video?
No, that's the only portion I've seen.
Okay, so the whole video is actually, it's like spoken word poetry, and it's about abortion. So she's opening this can, it's of SpaghettiOs, and it's actually blood, and she ends up pouring it on herself to it's
Oh,
a
really?
metaphor, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's a whole
That
thing.
at least makes more sense. Because I'm like,
whole
if this is
thing.
talking about just how people are so concrete they can't figure this out, we're doomed.
No,
You know?
No, there's a whole thing, it's taking so long because,
Yeah, yeah. It is
It's a
painful to
whole
watch.
thing.
Sorry.
Speaking of abortion, I was just scrolling through Facebook and people repost dumb stuff. So I was really bored and I was there's an article about Mila Kunis and she's been donating something to an abortion or whatever. So I read the article and then I just put the opposite. I just said because I wanted to see how people would react. I was all women have rights to their body and everyone can make their own choices. And some people actually gave me good thoughts, like Paige McGraw, you should think about this. And most of them were just you should kill yourself, or you should just die, be off this planet because you think abortion is okay. And I was I didn't say abortion was okay. I said women have the right to choose. I didn't say I was for it or against it. And people just blew up
And
at me.
they're
And it was
totally against
hilarious.
anyone thinking positively about abortion, but boy, you ought to kill yourself because you did.
Yeah.
You know,
There
which,
you go.
Yeah, it's like,
That's
usually,
like,
it's
wait a
like, you
minute.
should die, like, you make me sick. I'm like, you don't even know me.
Well, I also,
It was just, it was a really funny experience.
I think it's funny
Yeah.
we're starting to think more in abstractions than hypotheticals, and yet we find it, especially like politically, really, really hard to consider the viewpoint from the other side, and instead of like trying to argue it with a good logical argument, we just scream louder than the other person until they give up. Is what I'm seeing a trend as.
Yeah.
You'll see people who actually have a good debate, and you're like, okay, I see his views, and I see his views, and I'm like, I like his better, or whatever, right? But now, it's more like, instead of having a good logical discussion, or letting people have it, we'll have protesters throw a riot and say, no, you can't speak here because I don't care about your rights. Antifa. Yeah. And so it's worrisome.
But in that same right, there are people out there who just want to hear their own voice. Like, they don't want to hear you out. They don't want to hear your side. They don't want to hear your opinion. They're
That's
just
the
like,
problem,
I'm right,
yeah.
you're wrong.
And I think part of that, and this is going to fold right back into Nagel, when he talks about people are searching for self-worth, and if they don't believe in God, then it's to join groups. And like the Antifa thing, I think half those kids, or whoever they are, young people, just feel like they want to be part of something. And for whatever reason, you know, they don't want to, you know, go to college or join the military or go to church or whatever. They've chosen this thing, and they're just happy to be part of something, whether it's right or it's wrong.
Well, like I was watching one,
He's reading.
I think it was Ben Shapiro was going to a college campus to speak, and Antifa threw a riot, right?
He's like Berkeley, I think?
Yeah, Berkeley. And a reporter went and interviewed the leader of the Antifa movement over there, and he was like, well, why are you guys doing this? Don't you believe everybody should have their freedom of speech? And he's like, no, and I don't care that we're violating it. And the reporter's like, you don't care about the First Amendment? And the guy's like, no, I don't care. And you're like, then what is this about? You're allowed to protest, that's your amendment, but now you won't let other people speak? What the
Yeah.
hell? So it's interesting that we have such a horrible like gap in communication now. Even though we have great like abstractions, like we can come up with, I wonder what a better chair would be like.
Well-
And an engineer can whip it up, and you're like, that's awesome. But now we can't talk to people
We
anymore.
have the ability to figure out scientifically with abstraction.
How to go to the
and-
moon.
Yeah, like what planets are like 100 million light years away, and yet we can't talk to the guy across the hall. You know?
Well, here's something that you probably watched when you were a kid. Oh, wait a minute.
Immediately skip the whole music.
Sorry about the music. Let me ditch the music. Heck, maybe this is this. Okay, this will be good. So this is really dumb, because you know that is half horse,
Yeah.
half bird, right?
Yeah.
Which is impossible. Right? The bones are dense in a horse, so they can carry a lot of weight. The bones in a bird are hollow, so that it can be light and fly. Right? So mix the two of them, and it wouldn't fly.
I won't be able to do either.
Plus, at this point, right here, what happens if you're flying a light plane and you dip a wheel into the lake?
You die.
Right?
Yeah.
Actually, I had one student who flies. He says, if the wheels are locked, you're right. Because as soon as it hits, it drops right in. But if it's unlocked, then it'll spin and you'll be all right.
You can like really lightly drag it across but there's no point to it. Like that's a kind of, I don't think any intelligent animal would do that because they know that that's really stupid. And who was, like I was just reading about that bass, but Roy Halladay
yeah.
crashed one of my favorite airplanes, the Icon A5, and he was out showboating, being an idiot, doing that in a seaplane, and he still wrecked it. So I mean,
So,
Well, so you guys
so
grew up watching such crazy stuff, actually.
So like mythology and fiction in general, I mean, essentially only exists because of abstraction. I mean, how can we have a fictional story at all, or let's say science fiction or fantasy or mythological, if we can't think abstractly?
Well, I think that's more or less due to abstractions and more due to misunderstanding. Because back in the day when people actually came up with myths and stuff, it's because they were trying to explain natural phenomena.
Well, I'd agree. I'm
So-
speaking more of, and we'll use Harry Potter as an example.
Well, I
If
could-
you can't wrap your head around the abstract concept of magic, you can't enjoy or believe or get into the series at all.
Like,
But
this is stupid. You
yeah,
can't way through.
yeah, or sci-fi or whatever the case may be. So you almost have to be able to think abstractly to enjoy fiction.
It's more like this would be cool if it was real.
Yeah.
That's how you have to think of it.
Yeah, there's a commercial, I just briefly saw it on TV. I was actually watching TV.
She's a nurse. When you explain Harry Potter to her or any sci-fi to her, just completely through one ear and out the other. And I'm just like,
That's what my dad does with school. It's really annoying.
No, I get
it's
that.
super
yeah.
annoying because I'm like, in my family, it's me and my little brother, but my little brother has the ability to play video games, so he kind of has that part of the abstraction.
Oh yeah, that's fun.
And so, talking to my brother about like Harry Potter, like magic or stuff like that, that's easier because he kind of understands like some part, but with my dad and my mom, they can't grasp that at all. And it's like,
your brother's grown up with that abstraction as
Right.
part of his environment.
right, but my mom and dad have not, and it's just, it's a weird dynamic to
Like-
be a part of.
Like
Part of
Friends
that might
Talkers
also
from
just be the fact
1885,
that
his
they're getting
dad.
older and they don't want to see it as a waste of time. I've noticed that as well, because my
Yeah, no,
my grandmother actually has a degree in philosophy and spends
They're
no
very-
time. What did she do with her degree in
We should
philosophy?
read some of her articles.
She gardened. That's what she did with her life. She has no time for science fiction, no time for fantasy, and I've sort of taken some of that from my mother's side of the family. Like, I finally watched the Harry Potter movies last year because
Yeah.
I wanted to see what all the fuss was about, and I'm 10 years late to everything. And I watched them, and I was like, they were cute. I mean, they were okay movies, but
You didn't read the books though first, right?
No.
I don't understand how people enjoy the movies without reading the books first, because an awful lot of what happens in the movies are like just little, signs that would remind you of something from the book, but unless you're familiar with the book and the background of it, I was like, why was that there?
So the way I look at it is, if I go and I spend, let's say, an hour and a half watching a movie, and I'm like, hey, that was a good flick, I can go back and spend 2 weeks enjoying the book. Because it's usually better.
yeah.
Or, well, it depends. The Star Wars books were worse.
Well,
A lot of
like
people really
sometimes
like the
though,
Star Wars universe.
sometimes the movies do ruin the books a little bit because like if you watched if you read the Aragon series, right, and then you watched the movie.
Oh, the movies.
The movie was
Yeah,
terrible.
that's true.
But ever since I saw the movie, I could not picture the elf as anything but a redhead.
I know.
And she had black hair,
Yeah.
but I could not picture her as anything but a redhead
Yeah,
after
yeah.
that.
The
Harry's
worst
eyes
was
are
the
not
series
the
of
same as
Unfortunate
his mother's.
Events. I loved those books when I was a kid, and the movie was,
So bad.
it was one of the worst movies I've ever seen in my entire life. It was so bad.
Well, I'm surprised when I hear somebody really loves a movie that I think is crappy, like this one, for example.
Like, what was that movie that everybody loved? That big one with Sigourney Weaver, The Blue People?
Oh, Avatar?
Avatar?
The movie was
I don't
awful.
think anybody loved that, did
It was,
they?
it was a bunch of like,
Disney made their own theme park based on it.
And they're like,
I wouldn't change places with anyone tonight.
He's still alive, but barely.
just threw that out as an example of like, I watched that and I was like,
No.
what a horrible movie.
who is
And then
that?
I found out that some people love it.
Who is it?
Tim Curry?
This can't be, this has gotta be pretty close to Rocky Horror Picture, it's 86.
Rocky Horror Picture Show.
Oh, no, I never watched it.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Tim Curry's amazing.
Just threw that in
there.
there. Because I happen to know.
No.
So good.
Well, so
Like,
So the interesting issue though is, okay, so you guys are basically smarter. You're running your apps much faster than I am, and you could actually measure that from generation to generation. So and another way of thinking about it is, I was arguing, you've got all these devices, you're connected all the time. You've had so much input as you've been growing up and everything. Compare yourself to the farmer from 1885 who doesn't even have electricity and who's basically out by himself in the field with his animals.
Well, like even today, our basic understanding of biology, we could be doctors in the 1900s. All of us right now.
Pretty much.
We all know, oh hey, there's this thing called cells and bacteria, wash your hands.
Microbiology.
We would be saving more people than 1900 doctors would be.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, that's,
Wash
none
your
of us
hands.
have a medical
Boil
education.
that. Don't
We
bleed
know,
people.
sterilize that, wash your hands when you're touching new bodies,
Cook it more.
and there you go.
See,
We
that's,
would be
that's
saving
interesting
thousands
to
more
me
people.
because my whole life
That's
I've
scary.
heard, like my parents' generation, even some of my grandparents' generation, talk about how much better the schooling was when they were young. So comparing the beginning of the 20th century versus the beginning of the 21st century, I'd be interested to see like the middle or the later part of the 20th century versus the beginning of the 21st century. Because I don't think public school is as effective today as it was back then.
Well, but it's obvious that school isn't the only thing
That's
that's
very,
teaching.
very true, absolutely, yeah, for most
You know,
people.
you're constantly in touch with what I think of as the spiritual world. Spiritual, not in the sense of it's ooh, ooh, ooh,
Yeah.
but it's the I mean you're connected through the media to songs.
Yeah.
You know, whenever you want, you can listen to any song you want. You know, pick a song, type it in, there it is, right? Even if you don't know the name of it, you could use Shazam to find it, right? You know, it's just, and you're used to those tools, I think, for the most part, right? So you know how to use all these devices. You can answer any question within seconds. Usually when I say something dumb, someone corrects me in class within 2 or 3 seconds, you know, of my making the dumb mistake, you know, in class. That's incredible. I still occasionally will like go to the board to write something instead of type it on the, you know, so I'm still using old circuitry, you know, thinking, you know, how do we present this? Wow, we write. No, that's wrong. That's dumb. Why would you do that when you have way more information within a shorter period? It takes less to type it than it does to write it on the board, and you can see the results right away, right?
So, I just want to make, it makes me wonder, like, looking at the schooling and kind of the IQ test kind of along the same thing. If at the turn of the century, we're requiring kids that, all right, write down all the state capitals, that's your test, you know, learning that concrete information. Whereas, you know, now as you advance, they care less about what the capital is. They want to know more you to tell them how the state was formed.
Which
you know.
state is the capital Little Rock?
Arkansas.
Yeah. I
You're
see-
right.
I see what
You're
you
not
mean,
so
yeah.
Because he's the youngest one in here. Well,
Did you hear him ask the question?
Yeah, that's what I was focused on, was the fact that you said, which state is the capital of?
Yeah, I reversed the way you
Yeah.
usually get it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. But he knew it, and that's pretty cool.
Yeah. I have, my 5th grade teacher was big on, like, we had word play for a bunch of, there was a varmint with a mountain peeler, Montpelier, Vermont. She was big on that. There was all these, I can't remember what Juno's was, but I know it, so. I can't remember where I was going with that from.
But just the way school is taught, kids learn.
Well, it's funny, he uses geography as an example because people today, especially as Americans, we are known for having absolutely no concept of geography.
Yeah, they don't teach it in like high school anymore.
They just don't teach it very well at all. I remember studying it in 6th grade a little bit,
Yeah.
and I'm just interested in it, so I,
Have you ever watched a video of people trying to draw a map of the United States?
And that's
It's
because
hilarious.
It's
no, I
I've
saw,
met people who
Like
believe
that.
glasses by
We
text.
just have a really
like they were down
Sorry.
here.
Yes, the outline.
Okay,
It
I was
is
like, I cannot
hilarious.
draw.
And it gets worse
Or
the
just watch
more
a video of
remote you
someone
get.
looking at a
Ask
map
people
and
to point
trying
out
to name all the
Afghanistan or
countries.
Syria. You know, we got
Sorry.
people on the ground there killing people, and they couldn't tell you where it's at in the world.
no, I was, like Jay Leno used to do those walking the street things,
Yep.
and
Yeah.
I saw one recently, it obviously wasn't Jay Leno, but it was somebody, they were saying, you know, all these people, you know, they're much smarter than the president when it comes to North Korea, but North Korea is in South America to them. Like, they just have no, it's incredible.
I think it was Jimmy Kimmel who did that one.
I think-
Where is South Korea or Korea?
There's a lot of them. Yeah.
Maybe
And
it was.
that was funny.
So, not only are you guys familiar with ways of finding out information that didn't even exist 10 years ago. I mean, I think the reason the iPhone 10 is called that is because this is the 10th year, right?
Or 10th variation.
It's the
I
10th
think so. I
variation,
think
but I
it
think
is,
it's
yeah.
only 10, it's one,
Well,
two,
yeah, 'cause there's no,
each
there was
year.
a ninth, right? I don't know. I've got a 5.
So it's only been around 10 years.
Yeah.
And yet it's like, you can't even imagine life without it,
Yeah.
right? I mean, and Phil always laughs at my phone when I pull it out and go like this.
I laughed one
you know? Oh, and I forgot to turn it on too. I should do that when it doesn't really work very well. My daughter hates that.
Well, I think it's funny we went from having a phone and having a computer to having both in one. We're like, hey, you know what? Let's just make this easy and have one, and they did it perfect. I mean, we've come so far.
But how do you type on your iPhone?
Yeah, it's
You know, that,
pressure sensitive.
You don't type with your index finger. That's
well,
problem one. Yeah.
That's true.
my thumbs, I used to be able to play the clarinet, but you know what? No thumb activity for me.
See, we don't play video games, so we just constantly move.
Yeah, we already do that all the time. We used to-
So like, talking about the cognitive stuff still, and like wanting to understand being part of something bigger, making meaning of life. Like Richard Taylor, again was talking about, humans requiring meaning, and I see that, and the weird place that I see that is in conspiracy theories. And like, I think the basis of most conspiracy theories, like people were losing their minds. Like everybody remember when Malaysia flight, what was it, 7?
Yeah.
Disappeared, and people were freaked out that we can't find a plane. Like they were coming up with all these conspiracies about the government and aliens and whatnot, and they couldn't just grasp the fact, that we can lose something that big. Like in our modern world, it was such a stretch that a conspiracy theory made more sense. And it's the same with the Kennedy assassination, with 9/11. Like, it couldn't be just this one-off.
There's roughly 33% of our population listens to AM radio that is like all the conspiracy theories interconnected as the one topic that they have. I have friends that believe in like 9 or 10 of those weird conspiracy theories and think they're all interconnected.
And I
Yes?
think
Yes?
That's me. Anyway.
That's terrifying.
Well, I just do it for fun. I
Didn't
just
mean
think
to
it's
mention
really
that.
fun.
They're interesting.
Yeah.
I do study them because they are fascinating.
Yeah, that's all I do. Is, like, I don't
Conspiracy
like legit believe them. I just think they're fun to like talk about.
Like,
and, like,
even if they were
research.
true, what
But
can you
actually, I was
Yeah.
gonna ask if we could have like a conspiracy theory day because there are so many different theories, like the Mandela effect and different stuff.
Yeah.
That, like,
Yeah.
it's just so crazy. The
Well,
butterfly effect, yeah.
And what I think it is I think there's something innately human that there has to be a logical explanation. This had to happen some way, and for us it's easier to believe that it was
Well,
some
but
background
it's
thing.
apparently uniquely American.
Well,
It is.
yes, it is. Like, okay, so
We're very paranoid people.
yes, one of my
Yeah.
favorite ones is
Ever
because
since
Halloween
George.
just happened is the whole like finding razor blades in your kid's candy. So there's only ever been one proven case of a child dying from Halloween candy, and his own father was the one who poisoned him for the insurance money. There was only ever one case of a kid dying, and that was the case. And everyone
What about
since then,
maybe?
every year, is like, oh my gosh, like there's gonna be poison
Or
out,
Satanists?
or like razor blades. Yes.
Satanists, we have a lot of people that believe that there are Satan worshippers that sacrifice children and
Cow
eat
mutilations.
them and
Okay, but to be fair, there are like quite a few news stories about like young children sacrificing other children to Slenderman or something. And you're like,
Oh, yeah.
That did
what the
happen.
hell?
That case was hilarious
But-
to listen to.
But this
It
is
was
the thing.
disturbing.
It
It's
was
that
terribly
chicken and
disturbing,
the
but it
egg
was
scenario,
hilarious to
though.
listen to.
Like those kids hear the urban legend.
Yeah, Jeff, are you
Yeah.
familiar with that one? Slenderman?
no.
So technically, I think he's supposed to be like super tall, like 8-9 feet or something, right? And he has super pale skin. He doesn't have a face though. It's just skin, right? He doesn't have a face. And so then he stalks children and lures them away, and they're never seen ever again. And nobody knows what he does with them. He might eat them. He might, I have no idea, turn them into more of him. I have no idea. But he's an urban legend on the internet, right? And lately, there's been
Slenderman?
there's been like I think 3 or 5 cases where like actual like teenagers will go and sacrifice some of their kid in the woods by stabbing them like 60 times or something. And you're like, what? There we go.
Yes.
Caught in real life.
The kids
The first known mention of Slender Man comes from a Something Awful image in 2009. Some people believe that the Slender Man is significantly older, going back hundreds or even thousands of years. Regardless of his origin, the Slender Man has grown into a true supernatural phenomenon that transcends culture and language barriers. Is the Slender Man real? If the mere idea of the Slender Man drove two girls to attempt to kill their classmate in 2014 is real enough, let's begin. Number 5, Slender Man in House.
Yes.
One thing that can be said about the Slender Man is that he can appear anywhere, as if from thin air at any time, though he does have a fondness for people recording themselves or others using outdated media. In this video, a man and a woman enjoy a casual conversation as the girlfriend records them using a camera.
Things you know and don't know are staggering.
The man asks her to put it back, and as the conversation continues, the video begins to become distorted. The woman turns around to return the camera and finds the Slender Man towering over her in the hallway. She tries to run as the video becomes increasingly distorted.
You know, Abraham
Try to
Lincoln
climb out the
said
window,
that you should not believe everything you read on the internet.
Number 4, Slender Man in real life.
So these kind of stuff.
In this video, a few pranksters get more than they bargained for when they are presumably killed by the Slender Man. A couple of kids are looking to goof on people by ding-dong ditching a mild prank that
make it look cool. So
this
Okay,
is
yeah, but like friendly reminder, Slenderman started because there was a photoshopping competition on Reddit, and then Creepypasta took it and ran.
Yeah.
And
That's
now
the
all
only
of
reason
these,
it exists.
but it's like
But
all
it's
that
so much
stuff
fun.
became popular. Like when we were like in high school, so we were like, oh, it's Creepypasta, whatever. And, like we read it for fun, and all these kids that are younger than us are like, oh my god, there's the Slender Man. And it blows my mind because like those kids actually did stab their best friend,
Because
and
they
she
genuinely
lived,
believed it.
and it's so crazy.
there's also what is it, Jeff the Killer? People are like, oh, he's real now, and you're like, no, some lunatic imitated him and tried stabbing people. That's what happened.
So this is almost an example of the cognitive taking over for the concrete of the information. You know, we essentially are believing more in this cognitive fact of Slender Man. What?
Kurt Anderson, in his book Fantasyland, argues that the reason so many Americans are so gullible and believe all these interconnected wild stories about UFOs and abductions and conspiracy theories and the Illuminati and all these things are all and make the strangest connections between all sorts of things. Are also the same people that are also the same people that are the wacko Christian people in our from our history, right?
That hurts a little bit.
Okay, but hold on. Can you go and play like the monster video of the Christian woman explaining that Monster is run by a Satanist company?
Oh,
Because
Jesus.
the way the evidence
yes.
oh my
Like the
God,
piece
don't
of-
tell
because
me
the-
it's not religion.
What is it?
Okay.
Yes.
So what am I talking? What am I looking at?
So the Monster energy drink, it has that symbol with like the 3 cuts.
Oh,
Those are like the Hebrew symbol for 6, and so it's
Yeah.
the symbol
Monster
means in
energy
Hebrew
drink
666, and people are like, oh, it's the mark of the devil. Don't drink that. They're trying to brainwash you into being
Yeah.
Satanist or something. I don't know.
Well,
I'm drinking
It's
because
the
it's
very first one right there, the very
This one?
first one.
This video.
I've always
Oh,
thought
wait.
that Satan's favorite drink is Monster Energy,
Okay.
and now I finally have someone backing me. Let's take it.
Look at your M closely. There's a gap right here in the letter M. It's never connected. So you go into Hebrew. The letter Vav is also the number 6. Short top, long tail. Short top, long tail. You could have
Monster actually deliberately make it that way on purpose?
No.
Yeah, it's like a monster smashed into a wall with claws, right?
Yes.
That's the conspiracy.
It's like a velociraptor,
It's
like,
a cross.
you know, that's what it's
What
supposed to
has
be.
Christ got to do with an energy drink?
But
Let alone
That's not
being
Christ, that's not a cross, that's a Greek
That's
letter.
Christian company then. BFC at the bottom of the can. Do you know what that stands for? That's the F word. Big can. In fact, they write it on the side of the can, so I know that's the F word. Now, do you know what a MILF is? Yes. That's on the box. MILFs dig it, and you will too.
That's just marketing.
That's just
That's all it is.
Cross on the can. Here is the message. Antichrist. 666 in Hebrew. Is there another agenda?
They just cut it out.
If God can use people and product, so can Satan.
They cut it out. Okay, but there's also another point where she's like,
Yeah,
when you
my
drink
mom,
it, the
she
cross
real
is
cut up
upside
her
down,
way.
so it's like the devil laughs every time you take a sip, and like it's everywhere. It's everywhere.
Oh man.
So that's one of those conspiracy theories that doesn't
Well,
really happen.
well, remember Kurt Anderson's point in Fantasyland is that the original colonists were wackos that left Europe for good reason, both for Europe's sake and for theirs, right? And they founded wacko colonies that were, just absolutely, and then they got upset with one another, and each person separated off and formed their own sect.
That's also,
It became a national
that's
principle that
ignoring
everybody could believe whatever they
part of
wanted.
that colonists that came over for a better life. It wasn't just religious extremists. There was a bunch of people who were like, hey, you know what? I bet there's a better life there. I bet I can get rich. And so they all went there for money, not for necessary religion. So that's a huge swath of the population that went there for that.
Well, there is the connection between the Protestant mindset and getting rich, because for some reason that got to the point where they thought, if you're saved, God will reward you in this life. And so being a saved Christian meant you would also be a rich Christian.
That's kind of funny, but
So that's really the main point of Max Weber's most famous book.
Seems to fly in the face of Christianity.
I don't know, but to me that just sounds borderline like something that would come out of the Quran.
what does?
Oh.
Just the fact that if you're saved, you become rich.
Oh.
Like,
Well, I mean,
I'm
if
not
you-
saying that that's how they think. I'm not saying that that's how Protestant. I'm not saying how anybody thinks. I'm just the way that registered in my head that's how I heard it.
I think a lot of people misunderstand that. Because if you read, like, even just Old Testament Bible, what was it? Job?
He had everything taken away from him.
He not only did all his children died, his wife left him. He lost literally everything he'd ever owned, and he was destitute on the street for like 2 years.
In a gutter.
And he was God's like favored servant. So it's not. If you read Christianity, it's not a guarantee you'll have a good life. It's actually more of saying you're gonna have maybe a really bad life, but we'll be there for you.
No, that always really turned me
So
on.
it's
I
it's
grew up
just
Catholic, like you. You'd always go to church, and I can't quote anything because I wasn't paying that close attention. But they'd always talk about how it's better, the rich person who gives, a cookie to the church is not as much as, it's not as sacred to the Lord as the poor man who gives the only cookie he has to the church.
With the starving child in his arm.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's like, what the hell kind of logic is that?
Which
Like,
to me seems like borderline Scientology, who's like, give us all of your money, and
Yeah.
you get nothing in return.
Yeah.
Like,
it was making. I think that was just one of the parables. It was making a point that if you're rich and you're giving money, it's not the same as somebody who has little is giving as much as they possibly can. Because if a rich person gave everything they can, of course that'd be a lot more. But they're not. They're giving a bigger percentage.
That's why they're
percentage.
But a lot of the Christian sects that Kurt Anderson talks about are like the mega churches where the sermons say, if you want something, all you have to do is believe in it enough, and you will get it.
Sunshine and rainbows.
And I want 5 pink Cadillacs, and so, I'll concentrate on that, and God will reward me with 5 pink Cadillacs. And church is over, and he drives off in a pink Cadillac.
It's funny. 'cause
Everybody,
I think a lot of
I
people
want one
skip
of
over
those.
stuff. A lot of it talks about how I think there's one that says something about he who does not who does not eat who does not work does not eat, right? And a lot of people kind of like, oh, I'll just pray for a better life, but then they won't like do anything. They'll wait. And it's
helps themselves.
Yeah, there you go. I mean, go if you want a better life, go work for it, and then hopefully you'll be blessed that way. But
My wife has 3 homes that she's going to win from Publishers Clearinghouse or whoever it is that's making these homes. One in Colorado, one in Tennessee, and one in Florida. We've got a plan, for how we're going to live in all these different homes. And you get cars with them too, so that's.
Does that fall
That
into
could
that
be funny.
Does that fall into that same mindset? Believing
My wife
lottery?
doesn't really think she's going to do
Well,
that.
no, I'm like,
But
like
yes,
we talk,
yes.
yeah, and like,
Yes.
is the lottery a thing in like Europe? Is Publishers
No.
Clearinghouse a thing in Europe?
I'll bet it is. I'll bet
No,
I don't know. I mean, I was there a couple of years, but I don't remember anything like that.
they have gambling. Gambling, I think, is worldwide, but not like the lottery is like the poor man's tax because it's mostly
Yeah.
attractive to people that have hardly anything. And if you read the fine print, you know the chances of you're actually winning something.
And they counteract that by saying, you know,
They tax you on it too.
or they'll say some of the money that's going from this lottery is going to go to fund education. Like that's the only time my dad will play the lottery when we go down to Colorado and they say this one's going to fund whatever school district or whatever.
Well, like, actually, here's a good, also another thing. It is more attractive to poor people, right? The lottery is very attractive to poor people. Of course, it's free money, basically, if you win. But the thing is, even if you do win it and you're a poor person, odds are your life's not going to get better. You'll be maybe having fun for a couple of years, and then you'll be just back where you were as poor. And it's because,
shucks.
it's not because you were poor, and so you're going to be poor for life, because that's not, it's, the reason you're poor in America is not because you don't have money, it's because you're bad with money. If you lived in America for 40, 60 years, right, and you're still destitute, it's not because you're poor and you didn't have money, it's because you didn't know how to use money. If you know how to use money, you know how to save it, you know how to work with it and make it grow. America's perfect. You can be poor and destitute, and you come to America, you can make yourself a millionaire. You can, it's possible. Anybody can be a millionaire in America.
I would couple that with poor life decisions.
Yeah, poor life decisions and not knowing how to use money is what keeps people poor.
That's why I recommend to young men that you marry the smartest woman who will have you as soon as possible.
Statement.
And do
Done.
what she says.
Yes.
And give her all your money. Let her make all her money decisions, because she'll make good ones compared to what you would have.
Speaking of, I was talking about Roy Halladay, who died in the Gulf of Mexico in the plane crash. Actually, there's a video on Icon, is the company who made the airplane, on their website. He's standing there with his wife. He got like one of the first deliveries of the airplanes, and he's saying, "Yeah, my wife hates the idea. She's been trying to talk me out of it for weeks." And she stands there very seriously, like, "Yeah, don't like it at all."
They played that on the radio. It's almost like terrifying. Like,
It's-
yeah, it's.
And that's exactly what my mother said. Should have listened to his wife. Ooh, yeah.
That's true. That's true.
That's
It
true.
sounds
It is
funny.
true.
It sounds like, wait a minute, that's too black
We're
and
all
white for
boys
it to be
and
true
girls.
like that. But you know what? You know, when you look at the brain studies, you compare female brains to male brains. It's just true. Sorry, does this sound sexist? Am I in trouble?
Well, there are-
because-
No,
That is
no,
sexist.
I'm agreeing.
No, that is sexist, though.
Well,
It's accurate, but it is sexist.
I'm more
yeah.
worried about it being politically incorrect sexism, which
See, here's the thing. I don't
probably would
understand
have to be.
why we can't be politically incorrect. Sorry, I believe what I believe. You believe what you believe. I'm gonna say it. Like me, you know. It's okay to say a differing opinion, and the other people can be offended if they want. It's up to them to be, and they can be like, okay, this actually offends me on a personal level. I hate you, or you're wrong, and I'm gonna move on.
We want to achieve the impossible and make everyone happy.
And think the same
That's our
thing,
goal
yeah.
in life, is to make everyone happy, even
I-
though
I
it's
do
literally
have that
impossible
goal.
to do that.
Which is the funny thing about the majority of people who I know are more pissed off about political correctness than they are about the thing that was made to be
Yeah, I was
political.
gonna say that
Yeah.
makes me think
Let's
of
talk-
like Nico's story from Tuesday about like your friend and how like he gets mad about the African American thing.
Yeah.
I mean, like that's just what that makes me think of,
So-
because not all people fit under the title that we're trying to give to make other people happy.
Did anyone see the email?
Yeah, so I was just
Oh my God,
It's okay
yes.
to be white, and that's
Now
And they
here's
took
my
down
question.
all
Oh,
lawyers,
yeah.
they took down
Okay,
all
Here's my
blackers.
question. Why is that?
I'll,
wrong?
I'll read off the email because I made sure to send this.
I, the posters,
usually
I read up on it, and
All right,
it started.
let's listen.
It was started on 4chan
All right.
as it was supposed to stir up the pot. It was. It was
Okay.
to make liberals angry. It did.
Yeah, obviously. As the
That's
email.
not
What-
difficult.
Can you
Here's-
read it? I have it. I don't know.
Here's the thing I want to ask. So the poster said it's okay to be white, right?
Mhm.
I don't think there's anything wrong with that because it's not divisive. It's just saying
But it's
I'm.
not PC.
Oh, but if
Well,
you
here's
put
the thing.
upside.
But had it been, it's okay to be black,
Yeah.
or it's okay to be gay, or it's okay to be Asian, or it's
Then
okay to be
not have gotten
transgender,
that.
nobody would have said anything.
Nobody would
That's
even
all I'm
notice.
asking.
Alright, so let me read the email.
But it's
Yeah.
okay to be white.
It says
We all lose our minds.
It says, it has come to the attention of the university leadership that flyers with the statement, "It's okay to be white," were posted in various places on UAA campus. Further investigation has revealed this is a part of a movement occurring in high schools and universities nationwide designed to create racial tension and division with the express goal of eliciting media coverage. At UAA, we refuse to be divided. We honor diverse experiences and perspectives, including differences on ideas, religion, gender identity, sexual orientation, ethnicity, race, culture, nationality, age, disability, veteran, and socioeconomic status. And they continue on.
Do you
saying
do you guys remember when Michelle Obama was going around to schools and she would kind of start chants about how black girls rock, and the school would start chanting that, which is good, good for them. Black girls do rock. I love them. But had anybody said white girls rock, people would have lost their minds. They'd be like, "That's racist."
White girls ballet.
Well,
Black girls ballet.
But like the thing is, why is it okay to say a race rocks unless they're white? It seems odd to me. It's okay to be anything except white. I mean, I'm sorry, my ancestors thousands or hundreds of years ago were terrible people.
I don't know. I look at it
I didn't
now,
do it.
I'm applying for scholarships.
No one around here did
obviously,
it.
And I look at it, if I was gay, if I was black, if I came from an underprivileged household, which I can see why you get scholarships for that. But it's like, it's almost harder for me to earn a scholarship, especially if it's merit-based.
I always put other.
There you go. There you go.
No, I'm sorry,
not
but my
white.
Title IX training, I'm a black transgender. I can't even remember. I went as like opposite as I could.
I
It was-
I want to hear your guys' opinions because if I'm wrong, I want to be told.
Well, and
I guess there's
I'm in the
something
same
wrong with
boat you are, and this is what I look for. I'm sorry. You know how we do.
I'm with you.
Yeah, this is the way I look at it. I'm in the same boat with thought process. Is essentially you're being held liable for something you had nothing to do with.
Mhm.
It would be like if we arrested you because your grandfather committed a crime. I mean, you would be held accountable for something that a different generation did that you had no part in, and that's obviously not American.
Isn't that what the blacks are arguing?
That-
That they're being
exactly,
held
that's
accountable
exactly
for a
it.
different generation, what happened to a different generation.
I've been
Or
spoiled
both
rotten
different
all my life.
And
I'm
I'm
just saying.
And again, you're absolutely right. That's essentially what it is. That doesn't mean that it's right.
Nope.
You know?
This is fun.
Maybe the argument, maybe, like
See,
you
got
said,
us fired up now, we're talking.
No, I think I've seen a few words, the meaning, actual definition of words change in my life. Like literally does not mean the same thing. Literally is just sort of like now. It's just a word that you put because you don't know what to say.
It means
You say
this was
literally.
really extreme or excessive.
Like I don't think it
What
even
happened
means
to
anything. Like I've watched words and
like
like
is still
equality too has really equality has changed
Tolerance.
because
So
equality
like
if
is
you
still
looked at it,
vocabulary.
50 years ago when the government was actually actually racist, you looked at it, the equality would be everybody's equal. Now it isn't. It's
Everybody
like,
has-
like we're discussing. We have affirmative action, which is what we're just talking about. All these other concepts that are trying to level the playing field, but in order to level the playing field, must themselves be racist. So it's interesting.
I wish we had some diversity in this class right now.
I know. I've only been wanting to talk to people
Well,
who
we
like
do.
aren't
I'm
my
part
race, like-
Neanderthal.
I forgot. Yes.
Yeah, but I think they tend to be more of the whiter
Yeah,
color
we're
too.
into
So
I
That's
am, but
actually
like,
the explanation
I'm
for
so
it. Really.
alive, so like,
At the moment.
dating.
Anyway.
At the moment, if you're
So-
Caucasian, it's because you have a percentage of Neanderthal.
But like, I do find that really interesting, like what you guys are talking about, because the whole generational gap thing is so weird and stupid to me. Because like so my family used to bring the family history, so we've done the ancestry stuff, like got all the paperwork and everything. So like my dad is the second generation from Austria. I'm the third.
oh really?
Yeah.
Mine too.
And so, and like my family moved like right after Hitler came to power, so we're kind of newish, right? But then on my mom's side, my mom's ancestors were indentured servants who came over. So like my family didn't own anyone. So how am I being blamed for all of this stuff?
Do you
like,
routinely feel the urge to run up the top of mountain peaks and sing?
no, never.
it's
Never.
funny you mentioned that. Lately, I
Maybe
don't know what it
skating on
is.
lakes, but like that's
It's a stereotype.
That was definitely
Well, like it's just I see this huge double standard in politics, specifically when dealing with more left-leaning people, and that's not to say all because I'm generalizing, but we have a horrible double standard when it comes to race.
Mhm.
If you're black, we should not hold you accountable for your skin color because you were born with it. It's not your fault. And yet, if you're white, you suck. I'm sorry, but you were born with this skin color, and it's not your fault. But we're going to treat you different because we have this idea that within all of life, you've been treated better, which in some cases is true. I will admit, we've fared pretty well.
Generally.
However, that's not a guarantee. A lot of people suffered horribly. I mean, brothers
It's not
killed
like
brothers,
we
civil
chose
war.
it.
It's not like we've had a lolly-daddy time ourselves. But, I mean, it's interesting we have this huge double standard between races that aren't white and races that are white.
I think all politics across the board, but he kind of touched on this earlier, talking about, she said, people on Facebook said, why don't you go die because you're pro-abortion.
Oh yeah.
It
They
go
didn't say I was. They just assumed.
I know,
You kill yourself.
like, and this is, pretty much any, like, tough political subject, you can find a way that both sides have a huge double standard.
Well, I mean,
The Democratic side,
especially
pro-abortion,
the
anti-war,
extreme
because they don't want to
left or
send
right.
the men off to war.
Well, it's because the
You're-
extremes are the only ones
And
that
then
are
the
speaking
other
out.
side-
yeah, that's what I mean.
Yeah.
Because if you're like a moderate, you're like, I don't agree with anything anybody's saying. What the hell is going on?
And
you're
that's
like,
that's actually how our political structure is based, because you have that divide.
Yeah, you have
and people fit in that divide. And
You
we're
have
all
like
kind of stuck in the middle.
the right Westboro Baptist Church, and they're like saying everybody who's not Christian, like their idea of that should die, and you're like, okay, that's really friendly and Christian. And then you have the left side saying, you're a conservative. There's some choice words I'll use here, but and it's just like this extreme warfare on each side. You're like, I don't agree with any of you. Can we go to like, what was it? American government is based on. I can't remember the word. Thank you. Compromise. And yet, we're like as far from that as we possibly can
You
get.
couldn't even remember the word.
No, yeah, since we've had it, I don't remember what it is anymore.
Yeah. That's another word that the definition of it has changed.
That's
Yeah.
terrible.
Compromises, agree with me. Well,
I just
no.
have- am I the only one who, when I hear somebody who is anti-abortion telling somebody else to go die, isn't that a late term abortion by like 20-ish
Yeah.
years?
Yeah.
So,
Like they're technically
60 years in my
okay,
case.
hypocritical.
but,
That's
like,
one way of
they're
thinking
they're
of it.
still encouraging the abortion part. It's the aborting of life, no matter.
But if you go
what.
kill yourself, no one's taking your life away. It's you doing it to
That
yourself.
is true.
But
Well,
is
well,
there life
different.
in,
That's
no,
not
no,
much
I'm not
of a
getting into
difference.
that.
Oh,
I won't get into
That's a
that.
different
Let's see, we're
issue.
gonna talk about this later. It's gonna be a thing.
Well, you
Because
can
you're
tell
still
the
ending a
people
life.
who actually know about the subject and people who are just screaming,
Yeah.
killing babies is wrong. It's like, well,
Why?
it's a fetus at 6 weeks.
Well, like, I mean, I can argue.
Not like
I mean,
a baby, yeah.
I'm pro-life, and I can argue that. But I'll listen to you talk about why you're pro-choice if any of you are. I mean, I'm not gonna like, okay, wait for him when he comes out the door and take you out. No, I'll have a discussion, and
But why
if we
is it
don't
wrong
agree, we
to-
don't agree.
Why is it wrong to kill them before they're brought into a world where they might die because there's not enough food or there's not enough warmth for them to live in the first place?
Wait, I'm confused. Can you say
Well,
that
I
again?
guess
Sorry.
like
Well,
No, no,
okay, like, but-
Sorry, I
This is
don't
gonna be
wanna-
fun, guys.
No, I really don't
Why
want to
is
get
it-
into this.
well,
I'm
I have
inter-
a
I wanna
different-
listen,
I have a
so-
different argument to make.
I just want to know, why is it wrong? And I am pro-choice, but why is it wrong to remove a fetus before they are brought into the world as a baby, only for them to die after they were brought into the world because there's no food, water, housing for them to be safe in and grow up in?
Okay. So remember now, I'm not a
That's-
politician,
no, I
so I
know,
can't
I
give the
just-
best
I
answer.
don't ask
But
it.
that's like asking, okay, we have a really poor economy right now, right? It's because we have too many people. So say we're China and we have too many people. We need to get rid of some, right? What's wrong with genocide? Let's just cull
Well,
a
you're
few hundred people,
killing off
and then
people.
exactly.
Let's kill off.
So let's just
Because
pull
there's
off.
not enough.
Let's just
there's
kill
not
200
enough
people.
housing, there's
There'll
not
be enough
enough
food.
food,
There'll be
there's
enough
not
water. There'll be enough housing. There'll be enough people to mate with and have a life. And it's because we got rid of 200 people that were 20 something.
Okay, how about I throw this argument in? What if we just go back to Darwinism and take all the labels off all the warning labels off of things and just let people be stupid and kill themselves that
No,
way.
I actually
Is
think
that
that would work.
wrong?
'Cause I
Is
think
that
the
morally
successful
wrong?
product, you
Yeah,
would
that's
hope
what
people
I
find,
would-
people would go do research on that.
I mean-
Not a lot of people,
Well,
to be honest.
well, having warning labels on products would still be explainable through Darwin's theory of evolution, because the product
Ignore it.
evolved to become a better product so that more people would buy it, so it would outcompete the others that still kill it.
That's another interesting,
So-
I don't know, it kind of stems from, like, I had a little bit of touch on debate in high school, and I think it kind of stems from this, but my thing is with politics is, I always can spot when somebody is just putting, because there are certain, like, I'll use, for example, I was arguing with my sister the other day, not necessarily, I didn't necessarily disagree with her, I was just arguing with her for the sake of annoying her, but, she was talking about legalization of marijuana, and she was saying, why don't we legalize it and tax it? So why don't we do the same thing for speeding on the highway? You can speed by 20 miles an hour, but we're gonna tax it.
You have to have a special stamp, and your finger
Yeah.
sticker,
And then, and then,
You could do that because of GPS devices in cars.
I mean, we have
Charge
technology, you can do it. It'd bring in a ton of money for the government. And my point to her was, the arguments that she was placing on it can be applied to anything and be relevant.
Speaking
And
of-
therefore, the argument is not,
Yeah.
no, is not a good one. That was my only point, but. And she was really annoyed.
Speaking of driving and paying for it, as of March, there's going to be a tax on gas, 10 cents a gallon.
Oh, heck no. Did that actually pass, or is that just went up?
It
Did it pass in Anchorage? And so,
That's like our
so
everyone else here.
does that mean that gas stations in Eagle River will have that too?
I'm pretty sure we're gonna.
Does that apply to avgas?
Probably not.
Kitchen back access, we're going to mine ourselves.
I don't think it would.
JP8.
Because that stuff's like $4.50 a gallon.
So here's a great,
4.30,
here's a great quiz question. What do you think of paying more taxes on driving?
I think they should go kill themselves.
Yeah,
Solution
Is
to
this a good
everything.
quiz question? Because I believe that passed.
that's pretty dumb.
So you're gonna be paying more tax on gasoline, 10 cents a gallon, starting in March 1st.
We had a refinery.
But that's supposed to decrease your
We actually, we do have refineries.
property tax.
Oh,
Yeah.
well, if it's gonna decrease the property tax, then
Sounds like I'm gonna have to Uber more.
Yes, we are.
We don't use
Do you
like
not?
taxes, but
Yeah.
I'll get some good
that's
legs
What
here.
my point is.
No,
is
no,
like-
what I'm saying is that's the problem. We don't
Just
use
more
it.
tax or that
Well,
tax
we
in
have it,
particular?
Right, there's a lot of people who agree.
Just that tax in particular.
Well, part of it is, regardless of how much taxes we have a bad budget in our government right now. They're spending more than they have, and so as long as they keep doing it, nothing's gonna change. You're gonna add half a dozen more taxes. It's not gonna help unless you change how you're spending the money. I just think it's funny we're doing this.
When does it go into effect?
Yeah, that's a good question. Is that immediate or?
According to this,
we have
it's
until
just been
March to get out.
proposed.
everybody starts stockpiling.
Canada, here we
That's
come.
August,
I
though.
leave this day.
Actually, Canada probably
That
has
was
to pay higher
August?
taxes.
Yeah, that's August.
It's August 17th.
Yeah, I got the impression that it passed.
It did.
It did pass.
But Alaska pays.
Oh, okay, so here it is.
Everyone else.
Yeah,
I don't know how it is with
Who
more.
voted for and against? Let's scroll on. Who voted for and against?
There is an election coming up.
Hitman.com.
Vote by mail, just so everyone remembers. Huh?
Well, I mean,
But
maybe
the-
this will jumpstart us getting like a bunch of like subways and train stations. We'll do the German thing.
it's a media.
Well, another question is, he brought it up there.
How many folks refer to her as Amy Dan Bossy?
She's so stupid.
Who?
Yeah, she's,
She's the one who like made that all the claims about how teenagers were gonna go around like ruining people's houses and cars and stuff, and it got everyone into like this big huge frenzy, and nothing actually happened.
Yeah, because most of us.
It's
aren't
like
gonna
it
go
all
out on a
started
cold
because
night
they were
and
making fun of her
vandalize.
because they knew she was gonna make a big deal out of it, and then she made a big deal out of it. It was a whole.
yeah. it's-
She's
She's
my
not
rep,
good.
she's my rep and.
I will say, the guy she was running against when she first ran for assembly was my former neighbor. That guy was the biggest piece of crap I have ever met in this fortune. So, she sucks, I'm sorry, but that other guy was
worse.
Well,
See,
I
it's
feel
good
like
to
we're
know
always
that.
stuck in this
That
goes
guy-
back
that
to
guy
the
was
goes back to
Look at our life by this collection.
I know.
See, terrible
That's
choice.
what I mean. It's related to nuclear war, but this one's racist. Where did it go?
Remember the question earlier, why is it so hard to get good politicians? Yeah.
It's because if life wasn't confusing, it wouldn't be fun.
Two extremes.
Well, so I get to go to my doctor for my follow-up, make sure I don't have pneumonia anymore. So that should be good. I still have the cough,
Yeah.
but it's definitely clearer down.
As long as there's
like
no
in the
liquid in the
lungs.
lungs, you're good.
Yeah, I think I'm okay. But the cough won't go away. What is it?
No, I'm
You've had
on the
this
table
cough.
right now. I had the same thing. I had they call it a reactive airway.
Is that what it's called?
Yeah.
That's what they've been calling it for me. I had something. It wasn't pneumonia, but
You can try drinking like
Along with.
I thought I had a shot. You know, when you get old enough, you get a shot for pneumonia, so you don't get it.
Are you old enough for this, isn't it?
Oh, yeah, same. I literally am
Yeah,
dying
I'm
every time I
66.
go outside.
Hasn't had an asthma attack in years.
I'm ancient of days, as my daughter refers.
So is this good?
I think this was a fun discussion.
Oh, I agree. I just don't know if it was expectations.
My favorite thing is when we can all like start arguing and yet none of us are gonna get like in a fist fight with brass knuckles and like try to kill each
Yeah.
other.
Well, that's just about being an adult.
It's
Well,
it's like
Your
refreshing.
fluency went up like 100% for the hour and 15 minutes you had.
That's fun.
listen to my song. Go like my music.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Good times. Good times.
Well, I think everybody's fine, but we'll find out.
Have a good weekend.
Thank you. You too. And have a good Veterans Day.
That's
Or an
true.
Armistice Day.
We are going to the symphony, so
I'm
we'll do the
gonna
concert
barbecue some meat.
with all patriotic songs.
I usually just drink on that.